Okay, welcome. I'll get started slowly here. So this webinar is being brought to you today on behalf of the ASC Cytopathology Fellowship Program Director Committee. We've tried as a committee to think of good topics that can serve as sort of faculty development, especially for our core teaching faculty and our program directors out there. And so we're very lucky today to have Kate Hatlak with us. She is the executive director at the ACGME, and she serves on the review committees for medical genetics and genomics, pathology, and preventive medicine. And the largest part of her time is spent with pathology residency and subspecialty fellowships. And she has a lot of expertise in this area. She's really been a good friend and peer to our committee, helping us do some cool papers last year that we published in JASC. And she always has good insights, I think, that it's important for PDs to keep up on. And so we're excited to have her today. The session will be recorded. We will save time for a question and answer period at the end with Kate. The Q&A is going to sort of be run by Rose and I. If you have topics of discussion or questions, you can drop them in the chat anytime during Kate's discussion. And then Rose Wu, the vice chair of our committee, and myself will ask some questions. We have some questions prepared by our committee ahead of time, and then we're always happy to entertain questions from the audience. Before we get started with Kate's presentation, we had a few polling questions just to get people warmed up. And so if you are logging in after registering and not via YouTube, you will see the polling questions pop up. There are 4 quick questions that you should be able to answer pretty quickly. And Jamie, if you want to share those polling questions. Okay, so the polling questions are up there. It's basically asking, what is your role in pathology? Are you a program director, fellowship coordinator, faculty member, fellow or trainee? How familiar are you with the ACGME program requirements for cytopathology fellowship? Do you feel like the ASC Cytopathology Fellowship Program Director Committee communicates fellowship information and the ACGME updates to you adequately? This is anonymous, so you can be completely honest with our committee, but we're just trying to get feedback on how well we engage you as a program director committee on initiatives and updates. So feel free to be as critical as you want. I won't know who it is. And then question 4, that's a repeat, sorry. You can just respond the same as 3. And 5, in what area would you like more faculty or trainee development and support? From the ACGME or from our subcommittee in general. That would be program requirements, milestones, accreditation, site visits and program evaluations, progressive responsibility and trainee evaluations, or professionalism, well-being, and DEI initiatives. So those were sort of the 5 hot topics we thought of as a committee. So pick the one that you're most interested in seeking more support on. And Kate, you can feel free to use this to give feedback to the ACGME. Okay, Jamie, once you have a good number of respondents, you can close the poll.
We're still getting a couple more people. I was going to give a couple more seconds.
Oh, great. Okay, so almost half of the audience is cytopathology fellowship program directors. About 1/3 are faculty members, non-program directors, and we have a few coordinators and a few fellows or residents. And then, how familiar are you with the ACGME program requirements for cytopathology fellowship? 53% said very familiar and 40% said somewhat familiar, with only 7% feeling not very familiar, which is good. Okay, now slamming our committee. How well do we do? It says about half, 53% think adequate updates, 47% say unsure, but would like more updates. So perhaps we could do a little bit better communicating things. And then what area would you like to see more faculty, trainee development and support? Seems like we're pretty split, about a third with program requirements. 27% said accreditation site visits and program evaluations. Another 27% said progressive responsibility and trainee evaluations, with a minority saying professionalism and DEI. But nobody wants to hear about milestones, Kate. I guess we're like adequately updating people on milestones and they're done with that. So that's good news. Okay, and with that, I'm going to leave the floor for Kate, and I'll see you back at the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much. And looking at that last poll question, I think we've got a little bit of something for everybody, because I touched on a bunch of different topics. I do have a couple slides in there about milestones, but I'll kind of gloss over them, knowing that people don't want to hear about milestones, so that's fine. But I will start off by saying, as I get my slides pulled up here, I will be happy to share these slides after this meeting. So don't feel like you have to take pictures and screenshots of everything. I will share the slides, and as Sarah said, this is also being recorded. So don't feel like you have to capture everything. We'll get you. Everybody, see what you need to see? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Do we look good? Okay, thanks. I've presented a million times on Zoom, but you know, every once in a while, something doesn't do what I thought it was going to do. So good to see everybody again. I'm Kate Hatlak. I work with the Pathology Review Committee at the ACGME, and that includes cytopathology. So like I said, I've got a little bit of a smorgasbord of topics to share with you today. But looking at some of the things that were noted in the poll, I'm happy to come back and do a deep dive if there are specific questions about program requirements. I'm not trying to invite myself, but I'm happy to come back and do deep dives into any topics at any point, if that would be beneficial. So we'll go through the slides. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure we leave time at the end if there are any questions. So the first thing I just wanted to share, this is a quick trend, and things look pretty stable. So I hit my keyboard, sorry. So things look pretty stable, so there's not much to share here. But what this is showing you is the number of cytopathology programs, and that's in red there on the graph. Again, little tiny dip if you see it, 2015, 2016, and then it went back up. And in 2022, we're at 92 fellowship programs. But again, that's every once in a while we get a new fellowship program, or maybe one closes, but that stays pretty stagnant. And then the approved positions is in that sort of green color at the top. And then the filled positions, we are seeing in purple a little bit of a decline trend. And as Sarah mentioned, I collaborated on a couple of papers last year to kind of look at this, the delta between how many filled positions there are and how many approved positions. And there's nothing necessarily wrong from an ACGME standpoint when there's a little bit of that differential, but it does, for running reports, it can make it look like the specialty is underfilling. So not a bad thing, certainly, and nobody's going to come and say, you have to, make sure that you only have the approved number of positions for how many you're going to train or anything like that. Just a trend I wanted to share because I think it's So an update, and I hope most of you heard, and if not, you're hearing now, that's per ACGME policy, every 10 years, program requirements undergo what we call a major revision. And the pathology subspecialties are due for that major revision, so they're undergoing that process now. So that does include cytopathology. So what happens is that back in, I think February of this year, we put out an announcement in the e-communication and asked anybody to provide feedback and said, in the cytopathology program requirements, what would you want to see changed in the major revision? And we also asked ASC directly as one of the specialty organizations, and I know they submitted some comments. All of those comments were taken into account by the review committee, and they are conducting those revisions right now. So what's going to happen is they're doing their revisions, and then any proposed revisions will be posted for public review and comment in around sometime in July, I'm thinking. So again, watch the ACGME communication. It will be announced there. I can certainly work, directly with Sarah, Jamie, and Rose to get a direct communication out to all of you if you would like. That's your opportunity to tell the review committee, yes, we like the proposed revision, or no, we don't like it. So please use that opportunity. That's your time to speak up. Once the requirements are approved, if you don't like something, unfortunately, your time to comment has passed. So we'll make sure we get the word out as many ways as possible, so that you get a chance to comment. The one thing I will note, some of you that have been program director for a couple of years may recall that in 2019, the review committee did some pretty significant revisions. They weren't this per policy major revision, but there was a lot of streamlining and updating, especially in like the competencies and the curriculum sections. So it's entirely possible that with all of that work the review committee just did a couple of years ago, that there won't be a whole lot of significant change this time around. There's a couple areas they're looking at, some of the requirements around FNAs, which I will come back to in a moment. So there might be some changes, but I don't think we're going to anticipate all new program requirements or, a significant overhaul or anything like that. But the targeted effective date when this major revision would go into effect would be July 1 of 2023. So again, stay tuned. Now, there was also an interim or a focused revision done on the program requirements to align with changes made in the common program requirements about dedicated time. And this happened, it's in the very end stages. And so what happened is that the review committee was given some guidelines for how to set those dedicated time requirements for program leadership and program coordinators. Those revisions went out for public review and comments, I think around February. There was a lot of timelines at the same time, but it was earlier this year that they were posted. And again, you could respond and say, yes, no, I agree, I disagree. And so now the revisions are in the kind of the final approval stage. They're going to be reviewed and hopefully, presumably approved by the ACGME board in June, and they would go into effect July 1 of this year. So again, I know there's a lot of dates to keep track of. If you're ever unsure, the website will always show you what requirements are currently in effect, or you can always reach out to me if you're unsure, like what numbers you should be looking at. I will just note that based on the guidelines and the proposed requirements, most cytopathology programs will not see a decrease in required dedicated time for program leadership. The scale shifted a little bit based on the guidelines, but it didn't do significant change to most of the programs. And the program coordinator time actually was unchanged. So that remains what it has been for the last couple of years. I will also note the review committee understands getting the final revisions approved requirements posted in June and they go into effect in July is a very quick turnaround, especially when you're looking at dedicated time, which is sometimes a budgetary consideration. So the review committee will be, understanding and give programs time to adjust to these new formulas and these new requirements, as long as programs sort of acknowledge and show we are working on it. Maybe we're not quite there yet, but we're working on it. And again, for cytopathology, not a whole lot is going to change. So it shouldn't be this big transition where all of a sudden you're going to need like twice the dedicated time that you were required before. Just wanted to let everyone know the review committee will allow for a little bit of grace there for programs. So I just wanted to take a few slides to talk about, now these are specific to cytopathology, some of the common citations, and then some of the common areas for improvement. So what are cytopathology programs kind of as a whole, what are the areas in which the review committee is giving feedback? So one of them is responsibilities of program director, and that usually means accurate and complete information. I will remind those program directors on the call that you are ultimately responsible to make sure that everything submitted to your GMEC, your DIO, and the ACGME is accurate. We know a lot of times it is the program coordinators doing the lion's share of work entering the information. but the buck stops with you as the program director. And so that's where that responsibilities of program director citation comes in. The second citation is supervision, and I did see that some of that's progressive responsibility. That was one of the poll questions. We know that's a challenge in kind of pathology and the subspecialties across the board. That supervision citation is actually usually that the supervision policy that you have for your program doesn't contain those required ACGME classifications: direct supervision, indirect supervision, and oversight. So that is a requirement that you use those specific classifications. And so, especially when there are site visits happening, the site visitor is going to look and see, do you have that verbiage in your program requirement to demonstrate you're using those classifications? The next two, the ACGME competencies, patient care, and procedural experience, those are both tied to FNA volumes and your fellows reporting FNAs, which I will come back to again in a couple of slides. And then the last one, scholarly activities, that's related to fellow scholarly activity. And so again, I will remind those of the program directors, program coordinators on the call, the requirement is that every fellow does something. It doesn't have to be a peer-reviewed publication. It doesn't have to be a conference presentation, but you do have to do some sort of scholarly work during your time in the program. And you need to make sure that's reported in ADS, okay? It's great if the fellow does something, but if you don't log it in ADS, then the review committee doesn't know the fellow did it, and that's where you're going to get the feedback. So on the other hand, common areas for improvement, which we usually shorthand to AFIs, similar themes here. Again, clinical experience is going to be related to FNAs. Board passage rates, that's one in which your program's aggregate board pass rate has fallen below the 5th percentile, which I have a slide on that later, so I'll dive more into that. We talked about resident fellow scholarly activity, and then educational content and evaluations. Those are two of the categories on the resident fellow survey. And so that's where these AFIs are coming from, is if maybe there were some low areas on the survey. So in case there's any newer program directors, or maybe even seasoned program directors who have, haven't maybe dealt with citations or AFIs, I just wanted to share a little bit about what are these things. So a citation is going to be an area of non-compliance with either a program requirement or related program requirements. It's going to be something your program doesn't have, something your program doesn't do, or something your program didn't clearly describe. And I will tell you again, going back to that accurate and complete information citation, that third one is the most common sort of bucket for citations, and that the program didn't clearly describe something. Maybe you had in your major changes section, you said, oh, we added this rotation at this new site, but your block diagram doesn't show it. The review committee is not mind readers. So then they say, well, which is it? We have conflicting information. We don't know. If you do get a citation, you must respond to it in ADS. You can respond at any time after you get the citation, but you have to do it at least as part of your annual update. And you'll have to do that every year, and the review committee will review it every year until they've determined it's resolved. So an area for improvement, this is a little bit less maybe severe, if you will, than a citation. So this is going to be an area of concern, or maybe there's sort of a repeat trend. AFIs may or may not be tied to program requirements, but it's really sort of a heads up, like a little metaphorical tap on the shoulder from the review committee to say, hello, program, we see that this is an issue. We want to make sure you're aware so you can address it before it rises to the level of a citation, okay? You don't have to respond to AFIs and ADS, though if you ever want to give updates on how you're addressing something, you can just put it in the major changes section. That's a big open text field. You can pretty much tell the review committee whatever you want. But keep in mind, if you're having the same repeat, AFI or issue over and over again, that could rise to the level of a citation if you're not addressing it. So if you do get a citation, first of all, please don't panic. Citations are not meant to be punishment, even though I know sometimes they are thought of that way, but really they are meant for the review committee to give you constructive feedback on how to improve your program. So the first thing you want to do after you take a deep breath and not panic is read through the citation, make sure you actually understand what's wrong. If you don't, call me, email me. Once you get your letter, I'm happy to talk through. If you say, I really don't understand what this is telling me. We try to be clear in the letters, but I'm happy to talk through anything. When you are responding, try to keep your response concise, but thorough. And if there's multiple, sometimes there'll be maybe kind of multiple parts to a citation. So make sure you're addressing all the areas. Don't get caught up on one and forget the second half of what the committee gave you feedback in. And I do just want to remind everybody that interpreting tone in written communications can be challenging. And again, and I sort of touched on this earlier, but make sure all the information matches. If you get a citation that's, maybe there was, you were a little light in the certain experience and your response says, well, we updated the block diagram. Please make sure the block diagram is updated again so the committee understands what's going on. All right, so back to FNAs. I promised you I would come back to this. So these are the current requirements. 4B 1B2A says fellows must demonstrate competence in performing FNA procedures in a variety of organ sites. And 4B 1B2A1, which is just underneath, says that fellows must document all FNA procedures they perform in the ACGME case log system. So again, this is the current requirements. There may be some changes made as part of this major revision. I don't know. They're still undergoing, so I have no idea kind of what's going to come out of that. It's being discussed. There currently is not a minimum for the number of FNAs, and I know there's some discussion about should we set a minimum so there's a number, should we leave it broad? The overall focus is and should be on competence, not quantity. But right now, one of the ways that the ACGME, one of the metrics that the ACGME can use is that minimum number to at least ensure that your fellows are getting some exposure to it. So what does that all mean? As of right now, and unless something changes in that major revision in 2023, your fellows have to be logging something, some number of FNAs in the case log system. If you are a program that has graduates that don't report any FNAs, even one, you will likely receive feedback from the review committee, either as a citation, if this has maybe been an ongoing problem, or an AFI. So again, there's no minimum, but the fellows need to be logging and they need to be doing FNAs. So the way to demonstrate that is by logging something in the case log system. All right, I said I'd also come back to the board pass rate. So as a reminder, there's no longer a set sort of flat percentage that you have to be above 70%. Now it's the bottom 5th percentile of all takers specific to the cytopathology exam. And the ACGME gets their data right from the AB path. So it's a 3-year look back, meaning it's a 3-year average. And I will remind or sort of clarify that 5th percentile, it is a moving target. So that number changes with each exam administration, right? Because each exam, slightly different performance, there's going to be slightly different 5th percentile of who's above and below. But I will say that the review committee is being consistent with citations, meaning that this is a pretty cut and dried numerical metric. So if you fall below, you're going to receive a citation. And in some cases, maybe you fell below, but your 1-year performance is good. But again, this is an area where the committee is being very consistent. And if you had, maybe just one bad year and then you have 2 good years, chances are the citation will be resolved again the next year. So I wanted to come back to the resident fellow survey as well, because I do get some questions sometimes on, well, what do these numbers mean? How do I read this? What do I do with this? So first of all, to clarify, and I know the results for the 2022 survey came out just a week or 2 ago. So your program will receive the annual results if you have at least 4 respondents. I should say this applies to the faculty survey too. We're going to focus on the resident fellow survey, but it also applies to the faculty survey. So you have at least 4 respondents and your response rate is at least 70%. If you don't check those boxes, then you're going to receive multi-year results once enough data is collected. And the reason for that is to preserve anonymity. Okay, if you've only got 1 fellow in your program and then you get the result, well, you're going to know exactly who said that. And again, the ACGME takes sort of that anonymity, intimidation, those sorts of things very seriously. So how should you be using these survey results? You should be reviewing them annually with your program evaluation committee. You should also be doing sort of an internal survey. The ACGME survey shouldn't be your only metric to evaluate the program. It's just one metric. If there are any areas of concern, talk with your fellows about them. Try to identify the source of the problem, and ask them, how would you like to see this fixed? Understanding that not everything that fellows ask you for is something that's feasible or realistic, but ask them, how would you like to see this fixed? Once again, you can use that major changes section to communicate. If you get your survey results and you see that there's an area that's low, proactively tell the review committee. Say, we saw that our evaluation system or evaluation section kind of dipped this last year. We've already started talking with our fellows and our faculty members. Here's what we're doing. Doesn't necessarily mean the review committee won't give you feedback, but they certainly will appreciate the context and knowing that you are aware of this issue and you've already started working on it. And I will play Mythbuster for just a minute here, because I think this is a myth maybe from a few years ago that sort of maybe still percolates out there, in that poor resident fellow survey results alone will not cause the review committee to withdraw accreditation. There are a number of steps and other things that would need to happen before accreditation would be withdrawn. And it's very rare that accreditation is withdrawn. So if you get, some less than positive survey results, again, don't panic, work through it, communicate what you're doing, work on improving it. So I'm going to take just a couple minutes here and sort of walk you through, again, people kind of say, well, what do these numbers mean? What should I be looking at? So if you had enough fellows to get the annual results, this is what it's going to look like. And you'll see up here it says residents, but it's interchangeable residents and fellows on the survey, because this is a current cytopathology program survey. So 4 residents were surveyed, 4 responded for 100% response rate. We love it. So up here, you're going to see the overall evaluation from very negative to very positive, and overall opinion from definitely not choose again to definitely choose again. This is a very good looking survey, but you'll get a chance to kind of see where do your fellows fall on both of those. Over here, this will be the different sections, and I sort of chopped this survey up to fit it on one page. But if you get feedback that says, compliance was low in the resources section, that's what it's referring to. These are the individual survey items. These are not, as you can see, the actual questions. I do not know the actual questions. The review committee does not know the actual questions. They are guarded tight like Fort Knox. So all we have to go on, we see, the review committee sees what you see in this regard. So those are the survey items. And then here you're going to get percent program compliant and program mean. So most questions have a scale from 1 to 5, and the value of the scale, from like never to very often, or very bad to very good, etc. It will change based on the question, but there's 5 options. A compliant response is defined as typically the top 2 positive responses. Sometimes it's the top 3. It kind of changes based on the scale. So that percent program compliant tells you how many respondents gave a compliant response. So you can see for this section, for every one of those survey items, every respondent gave a compliant response. Now the mean, regardless of what the words on the scale are, the responses are given a 1 to 5 value, as you may guess, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. So the mean tells you the average of the respondents. So you can see for education compromised by non-physician obligations, not only did everybody give a compliant response, everybody gave the best response. Whereas if you look down to impact of learners on other learners on education, the next one down, you can see that also is 100%, meaning all of the respondents gave a compliant response, but the mean is 3.5. So there's a little bit of variability in where on the scale, even though it was compliant. And then you can see next to that, the specialty compliance and mean, which is all other cytopathology programs, and national compliant and mean is everybody who took the resident fellow survey. That's all ACGME. And then down there at the bottom, you can see the means and the compliance, sort of some visual graphs to compare your program versus national. And then you do get the 3-year compliance trend. So this is what the 3-year, 3 or 4 year, the multi-year survey would look like. So all of the numbers and considerations are going to be the same, but if you didn't have enough respondents in a particular year to hit that 4 respondent threshold, they'll aggregate your data. And you can see this survey was from January 2020 to February 2022. So it's 3 years and there were 5 total respondents. So everything is aggregated kind of across. But again, you can, how they calculate the compliance and the mean, that's all the same. You don't get the comparisons to the national because now you're looking at 3 years of data, and that's a little bit of a different moving target. Okay, so milestones, and nobody wanted to hear about milestones, so I'll gloss over these quickly, but the slides will be available if you want to reference them later. So as a reminder, Cytopathology Milestones 2.0 was effective July 1 of 2021. That shouldn't be news to anybody, hopefully, at this point. I will remind everyone there's a Word version of the supplemental guide that's good for curriculum mapping, which I'll show you quickly on the next slide. But that supplemental guide also helps to create a shared mental model, right? The supplemental guide was written by the same group that wrote the milestones. So it's a glimpse into what were they thinking? What did they mean here? And there's lots of resources available in the milestone section of the ACGME website, and you can always email milestones@acgme.org and they can answer questions for you. So here's an example of the supplemental guide. This is for patient care 5. So you can see at the top there, overall intent. And again, that's a glimpse into when the milestones committee wrote this subcompetency, what were they thinking, right? So it's right there for you. Then going down, you see the actual milestones, level 1 through 5, and then there's examples. These are just examples. They're not requirements. It's just different ways in which how a fellow might look at each of these levels to give you a little bit more of a tool on how to evaluate. Down in there in yellow, there are some, again, suggested assessment models or tools that the committee came up with. Some of those may work in your program. You may have others. Some of them may not work, but those are recommendations. Curriculum mapping, again, that's intentionally left blank because if you download this as a Word version, you can go in and map it and say, well, on this subcompetency, patient care 5, we get a chance to observe this during this rotation or this, this lecture. You can map it specifically to all the different touch points in your curriculum. Sorry about that. So that you can get good coverage of all the milestones, right? And then notes and resources down there in green. Again, those are just some suggestions from the committee on areas you can go. So I know that one of the questions sent to me ahead of time was, when are site visits happening again? When are they going in person? What's happening? I will tell you, I don't have a lot of specifics, and I apologize, but our Department of Field Activities is still working a lot of this out. So site visits are still being conducted virtually until further notice. There's been talk of a pilot of some in-person visits, maybe starting later this summer. I do think that even when we start moving back to in-person site visits, that it'll be hybrid. There'll be a lot of site visits that going forward, they'll just always be virtual, some that will be in person. If/when your program is up for a site visit, you will get plenty of notice. Don't worry. I know that's probably the biggest worry is, well, how will I know? When will I know? Are they going to email me the day before? No, you're going to know plenty of notice. This is your site visit date. It's happening virtually. Here's how you prepare, or it's happening in person. Here's how you prepare. Self-studies have been postponed through at least July 2022. And as a reminder, and this isn't a big deal for cytopathology because not a lot of you were up for your 10-year site visits yet, but they're going to be delinked. It used to be that you submitted the self-study, and then 2 years later, you had a 10-year accreditation site visit. Well, they're delinking those processes. I really encourage you, you can see this website here. They're posting all the updates and all the guidance there. So I encourage you to check there. And as these changes and sort of these dates and new protocols are announced, they will be announced in the e-communication. So again, you can always reach out to me. That's going to be, those two methods are going to be your most up-to-date information. All right, just a couple more slides, and then I will open it up if there's any questions. But just wanted to touch briefly, not going to spend a lot of time here because we can share these slides afterwards, but wanted to share that Learn at ACGME, which is the ACGME's online learning portal, has got a lot of great tools and resources. And again, looking at those poll questions, I think there might be some things in here for some of you. So there's two new assessment tools that have been developed, one on direct observation of clinical care and one on teamwork effectiveness that you can get from Learn, some faculty developments on competency-based medical education, managing your CCC and multi-source feedback. And then there's been a page redesign and a lot of well-being resources and tools for program directors, residents and fellows, coordinators, everybody. So these are the two sort of assessment tools, the direct observation of clinical care, that it enables on-the-spot direct observation. And then the teamwork effectiveness module, which allows residents and fellows to get feedback from their interprofessional team. So these are some tools to help sort of collate, make getting and giving that feedback easier. So you can see there's some links, some web pages at the bottom. If you are smartphone savvy, go ahead and grab that QR code. That is a real QR code. It was given to me right by the distance learning team. Otherwise, the link or the URL is right above it if you're not QR code savvy, and that's fine too. But again, just a reminder, there's some other faculty developments around competency-based medical education, which is where the ACGME is slowly but surely moving towards, talking about faculty competency assessment, and again, a lot of those well-being resources. So wealth of information and Learn at ACGME. You will be asked to create an account if you've never been there before, but it is free. So I encourage everyone to go check it out. A quick shout out about Equity Matters, which is a newer initiative the ACGME has started. Again, I saw some people asking or in the poll saying they wanted some help with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here you go. I would like to say I'm a mind reader, but it's just blind luck that I included this slide. But what Equity Matters is it's self-directed content, okay? There's either kind of a learning path or a video library, so kind of choose your own adventure for continuous learning and process improvement in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, the link is there at the bottom. If you go to the ACGME website, you'll see it through kind of that rotating panel. So lots of resources there, and they are continuing to develop new content. This isn't something static. They're always building. And this may be the most important slide of the whole talk, in that it is our contact information. You've met me. I'm the executive director. Cindy Riyad is our associate executive director, and Sarah Gluckstein is the accreditation administrator. Some of you may have already interacted with one of them, but there's our email addresses, there's our phone numbers. Please contact us. We are here to help. We'd much rather, answer some questions or clarify before something gets too serious, okay? So you can also find this information on the pathology section of the ACGME website. So if you can't find this slide later, it's on the website. And again, you can see my email addresses right there. So that's the end. I will go ahead and stop sharing, and happy to answer any questions that have come up.
Sarah, we need you to unmute, please. Nope.
I think my audio cut out and now I'm back.
Yes.
I was going to say I'm getting ready for my program evaluation committee. So I feel like this was really helpful information for my PEC to kind of, share the survey results and know how to do what things we should be doing and how to address and stuff like that. I'll start with some questions our committee prepared. So, any initiatives on the ACGME side to keep the program requirements aligned with current practice? Like I know AB Path does a survey for people when they take the cytopathology subspecialty board exam, and they've done some good papers just like Steve Sorlow did in Heme Path. But, you know, like I'm sure you guys, as you're now trying to revise the program requirements, what are the sources that you go to try to say, hey, how are we aligning it with current practice?
That's a great question. And first, let me point out that every subspecialty area, including cytopathology, has at least one individual on the review committee with expertise in that field. So we do have content subject matter experts on the review committee, and we rely heavily on them to say, hey, we don't do this anymore. Can we take it out? Or this is a new procedure or new, experience or whatever. So that's one way. Another way is when we do these major revisions is we ask the community, and that's that comment period that I talked about earlier, that we ask the community, both through the specialty societies and then kind of writ large, to say, what do you want to see? And then there are also, and I know, we talked about some of the articles that were, written in the past couple of years. And again, going back to the subject matter experts on the review committee, they may pull in some of the literature, some of the data that's been pulled to say, here's some evidence to inform. Very briefly, I will say that right now for the residencies, when they undergo their major revision, that there's a very robust scenario planning, sort of strategic planning activity that goes on. I haven't rolled it out for the subspecialties yet, but they're starting with some of the core specialties to really look into the future, not what is it going to look like in the next 2 to 3 years, what is it going to look like in 10 years, to try and anticipate, and you can't always know, but to try and anticipate, to stay ahead of the curve, if you will, and to stay relevant.
Great. Yeah, and the other question I had was, a lot of this is some of the requirements, like let's say case logs being filled out by the fellow, right? It's fellow dependent. I can't do that as a program director. So the question is, like, do you have any innovative practices to be compliant? Like I've heard some people do fake graduation certificates and say, you have to come on your last day and prove to me that those case logs are done, and I'm not giving you your fellowship certificate until it's done. Or a passport type approach, like show me your scholarly activity, put it on them to kind of fill out a passport and check the boxes and prove to you as a program director before they leave the institution. So I wasn't sure if you have interesting insights on this or advice to our PDs.
And you're correct, it is fellow dependent, though it does ultimately fall back on the program to make sure that's entered. And honestly, the best thing that I've seen, and I've seen this across different specialties, not just cytopathology, is we're withholding your graduation certificate until you come in. And again, it can be the last day of the program. Sit down, log in, show me. I mean, it takes if they've done it already, it takes 5 minutes to log in and show you. But I've honestly heard that is the most effective metric, is you don't get your certificate until you have shown us that you have done it.
See, these are the little pearls that our PDs need that you don't put in a PowerPoint. That's why I'm asking you these pushing questions.
Okay. Yep. Happy to answer them. Yeah.
So you showed some good examples of the surveys that the faculty and trainee surveys that the ACGME gives us. So is there any advice on which ones to target to address? Like, is it program compliance below 80%? Is it program compliance below the subspecialty or national mean? Is it the mean of 4.0 or less? Like, what is a good, like, I don't want the ACGME to come back and say, as a program director, you're not addressing the most burning things because this had a compliance rate of 70% and you didn't address it. So what's kind of a good benchmark?
Sure. And I will start off by saying there aren't any absolute like algorithms or formulas. So a lot of it is kind of looking at trends. I mean, is this like a 1-year blip where maybe something turned down? But I will say in general, the review committee mostly looks at the sections as a whole. They don't really look at individual items unless we're talking about things like fear and intimidation, professionalism,
Work hour violations.
Work hour violations, service versus education. I mean, things that really get to the heart of resident, well-being, psychological safety in the program. If those are getting low, then the community might start pulling some things out. I really can't give absolute numbers, and it's not because I'm deliberately trying to hide anything. It's just because there are no rules. And but I think in general, the committee looks, is it below the specialty mean? I think that's really what I hear a lot in reviews is if you're a little below, okay. But if you're like, looking like maybe a standard deviation below kind of the national mean, or the specialty mean, excuse me, or if it's been low for a couple of years, then it's something to sit up and take note. But again, there's no magic number. And they do look at kind of both the compliance and the mean and take those both into account. So
yeah, and I've heard from PDs that sometimes they use like the 5 lowest scoring items to address in their major changes. And, to say, like we discussed the 5 lowest scoring items as a PEC, and these are the major changes we're going to make in our program to address it. So I think it helps you maybe with the major changes annual web ads update that we have to do. And gives you some source of discussion. And I like what you said about kind of posing it to the current fellows, like how could we as a program do and address this better? And because, the fellows should be part of the PAC annual review. So that's good to kind of ask them their impression. But
we do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So the first question is, what type of individuals are folks considering for feedback from interprofessional teams? Nurses, endoscopists, and I think other PDs could certainly type in their ideas in the chat box as well.
Yeah, I from an ACGME standpoint, I'm not sure that we have a strict definition because those teams can vary so broadly. So I would open that up to other individuals sharing their experiences. But from an ACGME standpoint, there has to be some sort of interprofessional team, but it's intentionally left broad because there are so many different configurations and permutations.
I would think the cytotechnologists would be a good group to tap for the cytopathology fellows, as well as the proceduralists that they're working with if they're going on Rose procedures. That's what we do here. Okay, the other question is for FNA performance requirements. Is that done? Is that referring to procedures personally done by the cytopathology fellow, or is reviewing FNAs performed by other clinicians? Can that also be logged? Going back to that questionable definition.
Yep. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. It should be those done personally by the fellow. And I will make note that perhaps we can clarify that definition as part of the revision, the program requirement revisions, if that's a little bit nebulous, but those done personally by the fellow.
Do you want to go back to the committee question, Sarah?
Let me ask you
if I'm sorry, somebody sent a question directly to me. I just saw it in the chat.
Great.
I'll go ahead and read it out. We recently found out that our last year fellow forgot to enter FNAs. This is a common question. Because this data is available, is it possible for him to enter those FNAs now? So you find out after they've left and after you've archived them that they didn't enter. Unfortunately, once you've archived a fellow in ADS, you can't unarchive them. And we do have a deadline. It's usually around the beginning of August for all those case log entries to happen, because what happens is then all of that data is collected and aggregated across the specialty, and the review committee does get national level reports for all cytopathology programs. So unfortunately, it's impossible to go back and enter it later because the data has already been archived and aggregated, etc. Sorry, I missed that question earlier. I think that was the only direct question. So
when you mentioned the supervision, level of supervision, direct, indirect, or oversight, do you expect that to go into the Word document, like for the curriculum mapping, or do you expect that to be in the policies for the fellowship, and like, or in the block diagram, which sites have, like where does that permeate into?
So you can put it wherever you'd like, but they will say there are two places that the review committee is going to look for it. And the first is the supervision policy, because your program has to have some sort of policy for supervision of your fellows. In what circumstances are they supervised? How do they progress through supervision? So that policy should absolutely have those, again, direct supervision, indirect supervision, and oversight, and talk about how do you determine those levels of supervision and how do fellows progress, because they have to get to oversight by the end of the program. That's the idea, that they are as close to doing these things independently as they can when they graduate. Now, we know we can't do them independently because they have to be supervised when they're in the program, but you want to get them as close to ready as possible. Supervision policy is number one. The second place where you may want to mention it is in your competency-based goals and objectives, because you have to have those competency-based GNOs for each rotation. And the idea of GNOs is to show that trajectory, right? Even in a one-year program, how are these rotations going to help your fellows get from novice to expert or close to expert in cytopathology? So another area you could build in some of that supervision language is in each of those rotations to say, this is how we envision the fellow will be supervised when they start. This is how we envision they'll be supervised by the end, or like, what is the definition for moving them along that graded supervision?
So let me ask you this burning sort of timely question for our subspecialty. What does the ACGME consider telemedicine? Like telepathology. So I'm on a Rose encounter, my fellow's on site at the patient's bedside making slides, and I'm interacting with them via video and phone and all that. Is that considered indirect, direct?
That is considered, and I'm pulling up the requirements to refresh my memory because this is new. That would be considered direct supervision with the requirements added a new clause under direct supervision where it's in-person direct supervision, like we all used to think of it. Everybody's kind of in the same room. And then they added direct supervision via appropriate telecommunication methods. And I believe, and let me double check here, because again, this is a newer requirement. I believe in cytopathology that direct via telecommunication is allowed. And so that would be what you just described, where some combination of somebody is on the phone or on a video, and then others are in the room. And there's, again, different sort of configurations of that. The ACGME doesn't get super prescriptive about who needs to be where.
It's interesting because we have like requirements that, to do competency evaluations on our staff, our techs and things like that annually. And actually the direct observation component, CAP will not let it be virtual. It has to be directly observing the techs doing their responsibilities of, confirming two identifiers. So that's why I was just curious. It's a little different. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that you're physically there on site to be direct observation. I think that's great.
Yep. And again, that's new. ACGME sort of added that they added that language during the pandemic when everybody was kind of forced to do things virtually that they never did before, and then decided this is working for programs. We'll let each review committee decide, do they want to continue to allow this type of supervision going forward, or do they want to sort of roll it back?
And is there a need, or does the ACGME look critically at things that are indirectly supervised to make sure there's a must-call list, so that if a fellow is indirectly supervised, that they know when they need to get on the phone and call for direct supervision?
So there is a program requirement that the program must have some sort of guidelines for when fellows have to call their supervising faculty member. Again, that's very broad. We've intentionally left it broad so programs can set up their own guidelines, or like you said, you have like a must call list. You have to have something like that. And again, at the time of a site visit, a site visitor would ask, do you have these guidelines? So you have to have something.
I think it's actually helpful. I mean, my fellows sometimes maybe feel like once they've progressed, right, and they're competent, they feel like I shouldn't call my attending. But I say, like, if a patient's saying, hey, are you the attending, or can you get your attending? You damn well, you can get me. So you call me, right? So we do have sort of a must call list of like things where it is appropriate to call the attending, even if you're competent. So I think that that's an important part of indirect supervision.
Yeah, I agree.
Rose, any other questions from the audience? Or if anyone in the audience hasn't shared questions via chat, but wants to unmute themselves, we have 2 minutes for any burning questions.
Yep, not seeing any more questions. So I think if we wrap up a minute early, that is a-okay.
Kate, I thank you a ton for doing this. I found this very helpful. I hope everybody else did. And I appreciate you sharing your handout with us afterwards. And we will invite you back for some other topics of interest at some point. So thank you everybody for your time today. And we'll forward the handouts via the email distribution list. So have a great day. Bye.
Thanks.